So now let's talk about paper structure. One of the key things to remember about paper structure is the purpose of your report. And the purpose of your report is in some ways to tell a story, but not to tell this sort of story. So these are examples of murder mysteries, and the key point about a murder mystery, such as the demise of this poor chap Roger Ackroyd, or some death on the Nile here, and so on and so forth, is that the villain is revealed at the very end. So you have to get to pretty much the last page, to the surprise and astonishment of the reader, to find out what was done. And that's really pretty much the opposite of what you want to happen in your project report. What you actually want to do is to realise that your project report, your conclusion shouldn't be a surprise to the reader. They should follow logically from the rest of the report. You can also, it's quite legitimate, to signpost what is going to happen in the introduction. So in the introduction you can say, if you were writing the murder of Roger Ackroyd as a final year project paper, you would, in the first page you would say who the villain was, whoever had done Roger Ackroyd in, would be signposted in the introduction. And that would be a perfectly legitimate thing to do, because there should be no surprises at the end in your final year project paper. Another way of thinking about this is to think about this as being a sort of a news report. So if, for example, you watch some news from, for example, the BBC, what you'll find at the start is you get some headlines where they tell you what you're going to tell people, you get the story itself, and then finally at the end you get a summary where people tell you what they have already told you. And the key point here is that repetition is usually a good idea when you're trying to get across complex information, and so it's perfectly acceptable to have a degree of repetition inside your project paper. Now the actual structure is outlined here, and we're basically going to go through it from beginning to end. And so we start off with the abstract, and the abstract is meant to be a self-contained summary of the paper. That's one of the reasons they call it an abstract, because you can take it away from the rest of the paper and read it on your own, and have a look at that and then decide whether or not to read the whole paper. And quite often you'll find there are abstracting services that basically take abstracts out of papers, and these are circulated independently of the paper, and then you can sometimes get the abstract without the paper. And you want to put about 200 words in there, and that's really quite difficult to do, but you want to try and sum up what your key contribution and conclusions were in 200 words. So basically, once the reader has read the abstract, they should know the key headlines as to what went on in your project report. So there's no surprise as you go through the project. In the introduction, you want to follow a similar sort of structure to that of the literature review. You want to explain why what you're doing is important, explain a little bit about what has been done before, and to highlight your contribution. And then normally, I try and encourage people to make sure that these reports have a narrative, so you then say something that introduces your work and say what's going to happen in the next section. The key thing to remember, though, is that although you're drawing from your literature review, you can't assume the reader has read it. Okay, you basically want to make sure that this document is a self-contained entity. So there is no need to read appendices, there is no need to dig through your literature review. Obviously you're going to have to extract the key points from your literature review to put into this introduction, and your supervisor will be able to provide some guidance about exactly what level you need to go to. So in the theory and method section, basically what you do is you outline the theories and methods that you've been using. And the key mistake I think that people make here is they forget the audience. And the audience is actually someone who's a qualified engineer who'll be familiar with the broad area of your work, which means that you don't actually need to repeat simple things like bookwork unless you particularly rely on it in some very specific and quite detailed way later. So for fluids you don't need Bernoulli's, and for electrical you don't need Kirchhoff's law, and so on and so forth. And the general rule really is that if it's in a paper or a book which has the work already described, you should just refer to the paper or the book rather than repeating it in your project report. You're trying to make sure that your project paper describes your unique contribution and so on and so forth, rather than simply repeating generally known aspects. In the results and discussion section, well, clearly you need to put your results and discussion, and there is a particular technique where you actually start writing the core of your paper, starting your writing process with your results and discussion, and then you hang things around these results. I tend to actually just start at the beginning and work my way through to the end, but other people have quite a different view, and that's a perfectly valid way to write a paper if you want to do that. This section is particularly project specific, so please do discuss these results with your supervisor and discuss what the significance of your results, so you get a bit of guidance in that area. Also consider carefully how you handle errors. Experimental error doesn't really explain everything, and quite often it explains nothing at all. You can quite often quantify experimental errors. For example, if you are dealing with a ruler and you have a millimetre scale, unless you're staggeringly incompetent, you're going to be able to measure your ruler to within 1 millimetre, or measure lengths with your ruler to within 1 millimetre, and therefore you can quantify that error in terms of the measurement. And then you can also feed that through, if you do a little bit of analysis, into, for example, what change in height would result in a change in pressure if you're using a barometer, for example. So make sure you quantify those errors rather than just sort of trying to explain everything away. And also be clear about the significance of your results. You don't have to change the world in your final year project. You just have to make a little bit of a contribution to something, and it can be a very wide-ranging contribution. One thing to remember is that you're trying to, well, the best work really bridges the sort of divide between experiments and computation. So there's a couple of old sayings from fluids mechanics there really, that everyone believes experiments except the person who did them, and that's because the person who did them has a clear appreciation of the errors and inconsistencies and the level of fidelity of the model that the experiment has delivered. And the other converse is that no one believes computations except the person who ran the calculation, and that's because the person who ran the calculation probably has a good view of quite how general that calculation can be. So neither of those two things are true, but if you want to have a highly successful project report, you want to try and make sure that you bridge the gap between those two sort of fields, as it were. For the conclusions, basically you should make sure you have some. You should have a clear conclusion rather than just dribbling to a halt, and be positive about what you've done, but obviously you're not doing a sales job here. You don't need to over-egg the pudding somewhat. So this may involve a bit of repetition from the abstract or introduction, and that is perfectly fine. This is not a murder mystery, remember. A bit of repetition is not necessarily a bad thing. One thing I would try and avoid doing is avoid saying further research is needed, because that really, well, it avoids the issues, and also raises the question, well, what on earth have you been doing for your project for half a year or whatever it is? If all the end conclusion is that further research is needed, what on earth have you been doing? You haven't really made a good contribution if you use that phrase. It's perfectly okay to identify specific bits of future work that needs to be done, but avoid that being your only conclusion. Further research is needed is just a way of avoiding the question. And at the end, you should make sure that the reader is in no doubt whatsoever as to what contribution your research makes and also what your findings are. There should be absolutely no doubt as to what your contribution is. And just to give you an example of that, here are some sample conclusions from a report written by Robert Watts in 2012. So you'll see that, and I think this was a highly successful project report, and you'll see the conclusions are really quite specific. So the first one really is that they've used a CFD package here with meshing software to deliver a couple of types of fluid flow solutions for a particular geometry. And they've talked about grid independence, and they said, well, you can't really judge it just using a pitched average value, but you need to look at something else as well. And so that's a thing that he thinks is worth sharing with other people. And then he talks a little bit here about how a rounded geometrical trailing edge generates solutions which are highly dependent on the details of the trailing edge meshing, and also quite nicely here there's some actual numerical quantification of what can happen if you don't do that right. So you'll notice that none of them are about world hunger or world peace or anything as big as that. They're all really quite specific to the contribution that Robert Watts here has made. These are actually only 3 of his 6 conclusions, but I think they give you a flavour of the sort of thing you ought to be saying in your conclusions. The other thing to say about paper structure, just to close this particular section, is that rules are for the guidance of wise men and the blind obedience of fools. So feel free to move things around or add and remove sections as you see fit. It's meant to be a template, not a straitjacket. So if you want to split your results in discussion or combine them and so on and so forth, provided you have a good rationale for doing so, you should feel free and empowered to do so in order to deliver the best project report that you possibly can.